The invitation arrived on Wednesday morning, neatly packaged in a thick cream-colored envelope with gold embossing. I knew immediately that it was from Ezra, even though he had only called a few times in the last 5 years and had never visited Rockville. I turned the envelope over in my hands, hesitating to open it. Something told me that its contents would change the course of my life. My name is Crystal Yates. I am 65 years old, and I live on a quiet street in Rockville in a house I bought 22 years ago. My neighbors think I'm just a retired accountant, a widow who occasionally helps local businesses with their tax returns. No one knows that I have 9 zeros in my bank account. Not even my only son has any idea. I finally opened the envelope and took out the invitation. Thick paper, ornate font. Ezra Yates and Pamela Tramble invite you to celebrate their marriage. The wedding is in 3 weeks. I sank into a chair, feeling my hands tremble. Ezra is getting married. My boy was getting married, and I didn't even know his bride-to-be. There was a note in the envelope, written in familiar angular handwriting. Mom, I know we haven't seen each other in a long time, but I'm asking you to come. It's important to me. Ezra. He rarely asked for anything. He had always been so independent, even as a child, probably because he learned early on not to count on his father. I walked over to the window. Outside, the apple trees in my small garden were in bloom. White petals swirled in the air, like snow. I love my house. It's not too big, but cozy, with a wooden porch and old floorboards that creak at night. There's enough room for me, my books, and my memories. My Volvo was parked in the yard. It was 10 years old, but in excellent condition. I could have bought any car, from a Bentley to a Ferrari. But why? My car is reliable, comfortable, and doesn't attract unnecessary attention. Putting the invitation on the table, I headed to the kitchen to make tea. The familiar routine helped me organize my thoughts. I took out my favorite cup, white with blue ornamentation, a gift from Ezra for my 50th birthday. Back then, he still came home regularly. What do I know about his fiancée? Almost nothing. I think he mentioned her name in our last phone conversation at Christmas. Pamela works in advertising. They met at some conference. That's all I know. While the kettle boiled, I remembered how Ezra grew up without a father. Brian left when his son was only 7. He just packed his things and disappeared from our lives, leaving a note saying, "I'm sorry, but I'm not cut out for family life." The truth came out later. He had met a woman 15 years younger than him, the heiress to a large construction company. She probably seemed like a ticket to a life of luxury and idleness. The irony of fate. He was looking for a rich woman while living with a millionaire and not even knowing it. I never told Ezra about my fortune. At first, I was afraid that Brian would come back for the money, and then that my son would change when he found out the truth. I wanted him to grow up to be an independent person who didn't rely on his mother's wealth. My fortune began with an inheritance from my cousin Archibald Holt. He was a reclusive old bachelor whom the family considered an eccentric. Everyone was shocked when he left me his entire estate, a mansion in Boston and a tidy sum in the bank. Why me? Perhaps because I was the only one who patiently listened to his endless stories about his travels and ancient civilizations when I was a child. I sold the mansion and, on the advice of a financial advisor, invested the money in oil companies. This was in the early 90s, when oil prices began to rise rapidly. My investments generated income, which I reinvested in promising projects. Later, I diversified my portfolio to include pharmaceuticals, technology, and real estate. The money grew like a snowball, but I continued to live modestly. Not out of stinginess. Material possessions had never been a priority for me. I allowed myself a few quality items instead of dozens of cheap ones. traveled incognito to nice, but not ostentatiously luxurious places, and supported local charities anonymously. Ezra grew up believing that we lived on my accountant's salary and a small inheritance from Uncle Archie. I paid for his education, explaining that it was from my savings and a loan that I never actually took out. After college, he moved to New York and got a job at a large software company. Our relationship gradually became more formal. Calls once a month, then once a quarter. Rare visits on holidays, which eventually stopped altogether. I didn't blame him. Youth is selfish, and the big city is addictive. But sometimes, especially in the evenings, I was overcome with longing. Then I would get into my Volvo and drive to the outskirts of Rockville, where there was a small hill overlooking the city. Sitting there, I thought about the strangeness of life. I had enough money to buy half the city, but I lacked the most important thing: closeness to the only person who was family to me. The kettle whistled on the stove, pulling me out of my memories. I made some tea and returned to the invitation. Ezra was getting married. My boy was starting a family. Should I tell him the truth before the wedding, or leave everything as it is? I imagined my son's reaction: disbelief, maybe anger. Why did you hide this from me for so many years? Didn't you trust me? What would I say? That I was afraid of ruining him? That I wanted to protect him from people who were after money? Any reason would sound like an excuse now. The phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Ezra. It was as if my thoughts about him had materialized into a phone call. Mom, did you get the invitation? His voice sounded tense, as if he doubted my answer. Yes, dear, this morning. Are you coming? I heard something strange in his voice. Excitement? Uncertainty? Why is my presence so important to him when we've barely spoken in recent years? Of course I'll come. It's your wedding. Thank you. He exhaled with obvious relief. Pamela really wants to meet you. Me too, I lied. In fact, I was overcome with an inexplicable anxiety at the thought of meeting my future sister-in-law. Tell me more about her. She's wonderful, Mom. Smart, determined. She works at a big advertising agency, and her projects win awards. And she's done such a great job planning our wedding. Everything will be perfect. I listened to my son's enthusiastic monologue and tried to picture this Pamela. For some reason, the image of a cold, calculating woman with perfect hair and a sharp gaze came to mind. But maybe I was being unfair. After all, Ezra had never had bad taste in women. Where will you live after the wedding? I asked when he paused. We've already found an apartment in Brooklyn. It's not very big, but it's in a nice neighborhood. We did have to take out a 20-year mortgage, though. I bit my lip. I could have bought them a house without any loans. But how could I explain such generosity from a retired accountant? If you need help with the down payment, no, we'll manage, he replied quickly. I don't want to burden you. We talked for another 10 minutes or so about the weather, Ezra's work, and how I would get to New York. Then he apologized, saying he had a meeting, and we said goodbye. I put my phone away and walked over to the window. It was a clear, sunny day. Mrs. Higgins from across the street was busy in her garden planting flowers. Her grandsons, 8-year-old twins, were running around the lawn playing with the dog. It was an idyllic picture of ordinary American life. My life also looked normal, on the outside. Only I knew that in 2 days, my quarterly investment income would be deposited into my account, an amount that exceeded Rockville's annual budget. I started making a list of things to do before my trip. I would need to find the right outfit for the wedding, elegant but not too expensive, something that wouldn't arouse suspicion, but wouldn't make me look like a poor relative either. It was a fine line I had been walking for many years. Then I had to contact Lloyd Brooks, my financial advisor and probably the only friend who knew the truth about my fortune. He would have to oversee several important transactions in my absence. I went up to my bedroom and opened the closet, rummaging through my clothes. Most of my dresses were good quality, but not couture. I only bought designer clothes on my rare trips to Europe where no one knew me. The silver gray dress I bought in Milan last fall would be perfect for the wedding. I took it out and held it up to myself in front of the mirror. Simple but elegant cut. Expensive fabric with no identifying labels. Perfect for the role of the groom's modest mother. Putting the dress on the bed, I went to the bedside table and took out an old photo album. On the first page was Ezra at the age of 3, smiling broadly, showing his missing front tooth. On the next page was the same boy, but now a schoolboy, looking serious in his Boy Scout uniform. Next came his graduation, college, his first job. I flipped through the album until the end. The last photo was taken 6 years ago when Ezra came home for Thanksgiving. After that, he only sent digital photos, which I printed out and put in an envelope, but for some reason never put in the album. My phone rang again. This time it was Lloyd. "Crystal, how are you? Did you get my report on the latest investments?" Lloyd's voice always had a calming effect on me. We met 25 years ago when I was just starting to get serious about investing. He was a young, promising financier, and I was an inexperienced widow with an unexpected inheritance. Over the years, he had become a managing partner at a large investment firm, and I was one of his most wealthy clients. "Yes, I got the report. It looks impressive as always. I have some news. Ezra is getting married." "Congratulations!" His voice was filled with genuine joy. "When's the wedding?" "In 3 weeks, in New York." "Will you tell him?" Lloyd was the only one who understood my doubts about revealing the truth about my fortune. "I don't know. Probably not. At least not now. I don't want to spoil his celebration with such news. He might be delighted. It's not every day you find out your mother is a billionaire. Or angry that I've kept it from him for so many years. Or start seeing me differently. Or his fiancée." "I understand," Lloyd interrupted me. "It's up to you. But maybe it's time to stop hiding. You deserve to live openly." I sighed. We had discussed this before. Lloyd always thought I was too cautious, that my fears were exaggerated. "I'll think about it. In the meantime, I need you to check those transactions we talked about." We discussed a few more business matters, and I hung up. I spent the evening sorting through documents and planning my trip. I decided to take the train. The plane was faster, but I liked watching the changing scenery outside the window. That night, I dreamed about Ezra, small, frightened, lost in a huge supermarket. I searched for him, making my way through endless rows of goods, hearing him cry, but I couldn't find him. I woke up in a cold sweat, with an uneasy feeling. The upcoming wedding made me feel strangely anxious. Something told me that this trip would change everything. Perhaps the moment of truth had arrived, or perhaps it was time to lose my son for good. I didn't know the answer, but I was sure that the wedding invitation was an invitation to disaster. New York greeted me with typical mid-May weather, variable clouds and gusty winds. Stepping out of the station building, I was momentarily lost in the rush of people. It had been more than 3 years since my last visit, and the city seemed even more noisy and chaotic. "Mom!" I turned around and saw Ezra. He looked good, tanned, fit, wearing a stylish gray suit. Standing next to him was a tall blonde with perfect hair and an attentive gaze. Pamela, no doubt. "Finally," Ezra hugged me. "You haven't changed." That was a lie, of course. The last few years had left their mark, new wrinkles, silver strands in my dark hair. But I appreciated the compliment. "You look great," I said, turning to his companion. "You must be Pamela. It's very nice to meet you." She smiled, a professional, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Likewise, Mrs. Yates, Ezra has told me so much about you. Her voice was melodious, but with a barely perceptible note of condescension. She glanced at my outfit, a simple dress and cardigan, comfortable for traveling, and something flashed in her eyes. Disappointment? Contempt? I hope it's only good, I said, feeling slightly uncomfortable under her searching gaze. Let's go. The car is waiting, Ezra said, picking up my suitcase. We booked you a hotel room near our apartment. You can rest after your trip. On the way to the car, Pamela stayed a little behind us, typing something intently on her phone. I took the opportunity to quietly ask my son, "How did you two meet?" "At a digital marketing conference." He smiled at the memory. "I was representing our company, and Pamela was one of the speakers. She blew the audience away with her presentation. Then we got talking at the after party, and, well, things just took off from there." "How long have you been together?" "A little over a year. I know it seems like a quick decision to some people, but when you meet the right person, you just know, you understand." I nodded, though I didn't really understand. My marriage to Brian had been the result of a long 5-year relationship, and it still ended in disaster. We approached a black Lexus with tinted windows. Ezra opened the front door for Pamela, then helped me into the back seat. "Sorry it's so cramped, Mom, but it's not far. 20 minutes if there's no traffic." Pamela looked up from her phone and turned to me. "How was your trip, Mrs. Yates? The train is so nostalgic. I prefer flying. It saves a lot of time." "I like watching the scenery," I replied. "Age allows you to take your time." "Of course," she smiled again with her perfect smile. "When you retire, you have a lot of time." There was no direct rudeness in her tone, but I felt a slight sting. She probably imagined me as some old-fashioned retiree living in the last century. If only she knew that I earned more in a day than she did in a year. But I pushed the thought away. Such pride was unworthy of me. "What do you do in advertising, Pamela?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "I'm a creative director at Bloom Advertising. We work with some of the biggest brands in the country. You may have seen our campaign for Stella Vita, a premium cosmetics line. I had seen it and even owned some shares in the company that made the cosmetics, but I kept that to myself." "That sounds impressive." "It really is," Ezra chimed in from the back seat. "Pamela won 2 awards for that campaign. She's a true professional." Pamela smiled sweetly, clearly accustomed to compliments. "In advertising, it's all about connections and making an impression," she said, glancing at me quickly in the rearview mirror. "What about you, Mrs. Yates? Ezra mentioned that you're an accountant?" Again, that tone, as if she were talking about something unprestigious, outdated. "Yes, I used to be an accountant in Rockville. I'm retired now, but I sometimes consult for local businesses." "How lovely," she said, and I noticed Ezra wince slightly at her condescending tone. But he said nothing, just focused on the road. The rest of the trip was spent in tense silence. I looked out the window at the skyscrapers rushing by and thought that my first impression of Pamela was even worse than I had feared. Ambitious, self-assured, and seemingly dismissive of me as a harmless small-town girl not worth her attention. The hotel where I was staying turned out to be a decent mid-range establishment in Chelsea. Ezra helped carry my suitcase to my room. "I need to go back to the office for a couple of hours," he said when we were alone. "Pamela went to her final dress fitting. Do you mind relaxing? We have a rehearsal dinner tonight. I'll pick you up at 7. "Sure, go ahead," I smiled. "I really need to relax a little after the trip." He kissed me on the cheek and left, and I sank into a chair, feeling tired not so much from the trip as from meeting my future sister-in-law for the first time. Pamela was exactly as I had imagined her, calculating and arrogant. But what really bothered me was the way Ezra looked at her, with adoration, as if she were the center of his universe. He didn't notice her condescending attitude toward me, or he chose to ignore it. I unpacked my things, took a shower, and lay down for a nap, setting the alarm for 6 o'clock. When I woke up, I spent a long time choosing an outfit for the evening. I settled on a dark blue suit with a silver brooch, elegant enough for a rehearsal dinner, but not overly formal. Ezra picked me up at 7 sharp. He looked a little tired but excited. "You'll meet Pamela's parents just in time," he said as we drove to the restaurant. "They flew in from Boston this afternoon." "What are they like?" "Nice people. Her father, Hamish Tramble, owns a chain of building supply stores. Her mother, Olivia, runs some kind of charity. They're a little conservative, but they love Pamela very much." I nodded, wondering if they knew their daughter's true nature or if she only showed them the version of herself they wanted to see. The restaurant turned out to be a trendy place with signature cuisine. Inside, about 20 people had already gathered, close friends and relatives of the bride and groom. Pamela stood in the center of a small group, talking animatedly and laughing loudly from time to time. She was wearing an intricately tailored beige dress that I was sure cost at least several $1,000s. Noticing us, she interrupted her conversation and approached us with a forced smile. "There you are, Mom, Dad," she said, turning to a middle-aged couple standing nearby. "This is Mrs. Yates, Ezra's mother." Hamish Tramble turned out to be a stocky man with graying temples and a firm handshake. His wife, Olivia, a delicate woman with immaculate hair, very similar to her daughter, gave me a measuring look. "Nice to meet you," she said in a tone that betrayed a hint of disappointment. Clearly, I had not made a good impression on her. "Likewise," I replied calmly, accustomed to such assessments. "Mrs. Yates, I understand you're from Rockville?" Hamish inquired. "Nice town. I have a couple of shops there." "Yes, it's a cozy place." "It must be a big change for you, moving from such a quiet town to New York," Olivia interjected with a slight smile. "I hope the noise of the big city isn't too tiring for you." "I lived in New York when I was younger," I replied. "The city has changed, but I'm familiar with its rhythm." Olivia looked slightly surprised, as if she hadn't expected a provincial accountant to have such a past. "Really? Pamela didn't mention that." "My mother lived here before I was born," Ezra interjected. "Then we moved to Rockville." "I see," Olivia said, clearly losing interest in the subject. Pamela took Ezra by the arm. "Darling, you must introduce your mother to Jenna and Ryan. They just arrived." It was an obvious ploy to get him away from our conversation. Ezra didn't seem to notice and willingly followed her, leaving me with her parents. "How long have you been retired, Mrs. Yates?" Hamish asked, filling the glasses with champagne. "Officially, about 5 years, but I still consult for a few clients. Accounting is such a stable profession," Olivia remarked. "Pamela always wanted a more creative career. She stood out for her abilities from an early age." I nodded, not wanting to get into a debate about the merits of different professions. "You have a wonderful daughter." It wasn't an outright lie. Pamela was undoubtedly smart and ambitious. It was just that her personality left something to be desired. The conversation was becoming increasingly awkward, and I was glad when it was announced that it was time to sit down at the table. I was seated between Ezra's friend, whose name I immediately forgot, and an elderly lady who turned out to be Pamela's aunt. Dinner followed the standard script for such events: toasts, laughter, memories of how the young couple had met. Pamela shone as she recounted the story of their first meeting with such artistry that even I, knowing the truth from Ezra, almost believed her version of events. I watched my son sitting next to her. He looked at her adoringly, never taking his eyes off her, as if she were the only source of light in the room. Once upon a time, Brian used to look at me that way. The memory brought back a dull ache. At one point, I caught Pamela's searching gaze. She whispered something to her friend sitting next to her, and they both laughed softly, glancing in my direction. I pretended not to notice, focusing on my dessert. Mrs. Yates, Pamela said across the table when the coffee was served. Ezra said you're planning to stay until the end of the week after the wedding? I hope you won't be bored in the hotel while we're on our honeymoon. Her tone was polite, but her words sounded like a hint that I might be a burden. Don't worry, I'll find something to do, I replied calmly. There's always something to see in New York. Of course, she smiled. If you need anything, my mother will be happy to help. Right, Mom? Olivia forced a smile that clearly said that help from her provincial mother-in-law was not part of her plans. Of course, dear. I felt tired from the fake politeness and forced smiles. Excuse me, I said, and went out into the restaurant lobby to take a break from the noise and tension. Leaning on the railing of a small balcony overlooking the street, I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. New York was bustling and sparkling with lights, indifferent to my worries. Crystal, it can't be. I turned at the familiar voice and saw Lloyd Brooks coming out of the restaurant. Lloyd, what are you doing here? He smiled as he approached. Business dinner with clients in the next room. I saw you when I was walking by. Are you at your son's wedding? Just the rehearsal dinner. The wedding is the day after tomorrow. Lloyd looked good, fit, with a touch of gray at his temples, wearing an impeccable suit. The years had added dignity, but not age. What do you think of your future daughter-in-law? He asked, leaning against the railing next to me. I sighed. To be honest, I'm not thrilled. She's arrogant, and she seems to think I'm a worthless old woman. She doesn't know who she's dealing with, Lloyd smiled. I bet she'd change her tune if she knew about your assets. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. I don't want people to treat me differently because of money. You haven't told Ezra? No. And looking at his fiancée, I think I made the right decision. She'd instantly switch her attention from him to me and my wealth. Lloyd shook his head. Not all people are like that, Crystal. Perhaps you underestimate your son and his choice. Maybe, but I see how she looks at me, with barely concealed contempt. And how she manipulates Ezra. He's like he's under a spell. He can't see anything but her. Love is often blind, Lloyd remarked. But it passes. I'm afraid by the time it passes, it will be too late. The balcony door opened and Ezra appeared looking worried. Mom, there you are. I was looking for you. He noticed Lloyd. Hello. Ezra, this is Lloyd Brooks, an old friend of mine. I introduced him. Lloyd, this is my son Ezra. They shook hands. Nice to meet you, Lloyd said. Congratulations on your upcoming wedding. Thank you, Ezra said, looking slightly puzzled. Mom never mentioned you. We met many years ago when your mother was consulting for my company on tax issues. Lloyd lied smoothly. We've stayed in touch ever since. Ezra nodded, accepting the explanation. Pamela would like to discuss the details of tomorrow with you, Mom. Would you mind coming back to the table? Of course, I said, turning to Lloyd. It was nice to meet you. Likewise, he said, handing me his business card. Give me a call if you have time before you leave. I could show you my new office. I took the card, realizing that he was offering to meet to discuss the situation in more detail. I will. When Ezra and I returned to the hall, Pamela was already telling the guests about her wedding dress, deliberately leaving out the details to keep the element of surprise. Ah, there you are, she smiled at us. Mrs. Yates, I was just talking about tomorrow's rehearsal. You need to be at the church by 2 o'clock. I hope that's not too early for you. Not at all, I replied, ignoring yet another hint about my age. Wonderful. Ezra, dear, will you make sure your mother gets to the church on time? She may have trouble finding her way around town. Of course, I'll pick her up. Ezra nodded, not noticing his fiancée's condescending tone. I watched their interaction with growing concern. Pamela skillfully guided every conversation, every decision, and Ezra willingly followed her instructions. It was an unhealthy dynamic, but I knew that any interference on my part would only push my son away. The evening was coming to an end, and the guests began to leave. Ezra offered to drive me back to the hotel, but I insisted on a taxi, seeing how Pamela was glancing impatiently at her watch. "See you tomorrow, dear." I kissed him on the cheek. "It was nice to meet everyone." "See you tomorrow, Mrs. Yates." Pamela gave me another one of her perfect smiles. "I hope you get some rest." In the taxi, I took out Lloyd's business card. On the back, he had scribbled, "Breakfast at 8, Bristol Cafe, on the corner of your hotel. We need to talk." I put the card in my bag, thinking about the evening. Pamela turned out to be even worse than I had expected, calculating, manipulative, with a clear contempt for people she considered inferior to herself. Ezra, my intelligent, sensible son, seemed oblivious to her true nature, blinded by her beauty and charisma. When I got back to my room, I called Lloyd to confirm our meeting. The conversation was brief. We both understood the need to discuss the situation in person. As I fell asleep, I thought about how I had to remain neutral for my son's happiness, even if I thought his choice was wrong. After all, it was his life and his decisions. But something told me that silence could lead to even bigger problems. I also thought about how Pamela's behavior would change if she found out about my true financial situation. The thought brought a bitter smile to my lips. Her reaction would be so predictable, but I decided not to reveal my secret. At least not yet. Let the wedding go ahead as planned, without any unnecessary drama or upheaval. I would discuss it with Lloyd tomorrow. He always gave me wise advice. The morning of the wedding day was clear and cloudless, as if nature itself was blessing the union. I woke up early, before 7, and stood at the window for a long time, watching the city gradually come to life. Breakfast with Lloyd the night before had left me with mixed feelings. "You have to tell Ezra the truth about your financial situation," he insisted, stirring his coffee. "Especially now that he's committing his life to a woman like Pamela." "What difference would that make?" I objected. "It will only complicate things. If he really loves her or is under her influence." Lloyd shook his head. "I've only seen them together for a few minutes, but even I can see that she's manipulating him." I couldn't disagree with his observation, but I still had my doubts. Telling the truth now, on the eve of the wedding, would cause chaos. Ezra would feel betrayed, and Pamela? Well, it wasn't hard to imagine her reaction. In the end, Lloyd and I agreed that I would wait until after the wedding. He promised to come to the ceremony as my old friend. Pamela reluctantly added him to the guest list after yesterday's chance encounter. A knock on the door brought me out of my reverie. Standing on the doorstep was a young woman with a makeup case. "Mrs. Yates? I'm Ashley, the makeup artist. Miss Tramble sent me to help you get ready for the ceremony." I raised an eyebrow in surprise. Pamela hadn't mentioned this. "This is unexpected, but why not?" I replied after a moment's thought. "Come in, Ashley." The girl entered and began laying out her tools on the dressing table. "Miss Tramble gave me some instructions about your look," she began, a little uncertainly. "I'm sure she did," I smiled. "But you know what? Let me tell you what I want. After all, it's my face." Ashley looked a little puzzled, but nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Yates. What would you prefer?" "I want natural, elegant makeup. Nothing flashy or too youthful. And no experiments with lilac eyeshadow," I said, noticing the corresponding palette in her makeup bag. Pastel colors, light eyeliner, a little mascara, and a warm pink lipstick, not bright red. Ashley nodded, clearly appreciating my knowledge of makeup. And your hair? Something classic and elegant. No bouffants or overly complicated styles. Maybe a low bun with a few strands loose around the face? Great. Ashley seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. I have to admit, Miss Trumbull's instructions were a little different. I'm sure they were, I said dryly. But I'm sure we can create a look that will be both dignified and elegant. After all, I'm the mother of the groom, not a guest star on a reality show. Ashley chuckled softly, and I felt a sense of understanding between us. The next hour passed in pleasant conversation as she worked on my look, following my wishes but adding her professional touches. When she was finished, I was more than pleased with the result. The mirror reflected an elegant woman of 65, not trying to look younger, but not looking old-fashioned either. You look stunning, Mrs. Yates, Ashley said sincerely, very sophisticated. Thank you, dear. You're a wonderful professional, I said, handing her a generous tip, which she initially tried to decline. Please take it. You did exactly what I wanted. After Ashley left, I put on my silver gray dress from a Milanese designer and low-heeled shoes. I accessorized with pearl earrings and a thin platinum bracelet, subtle but tasteful. Ezra picked me up around 11. He was wearing a tuxedo, excited and happy. You look beautiful, Mom, he said, kissing me on the cheek. Are you ready for the big day? Of course, dear. Are you? Are you nervous? A little, he admitted with a smile. But in a good way. Pamela has organized everything. It's going to be perfect. On the way to the church, he told me about the last-minute preparations, the guests who had flown in from far away, and the honeymoon they were planning to spend in Bali. I listened, happy for him, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The church chosen for the ceremony was old and beautiful, with stained glass windows through which the sunlight streamed in multicolored rays. The guests were already gathering, talking in hushed tones. I noticed Lloyd sitting in the third row. He nodded to me, and I responded with a slight smile. Ezra led me to a seat in the front row, next to Pamela's parents. Olivia Tramble gave me a once-over, raising her eyebrows slightly. Mrs. Yates, she said with a forced smile. What an interesting dress. Pamela mentioned that she sent a stylist to you. Yes, that was very kind of her, I replied neutrally. Ashley is a wonderful professional. She pursed her lips, clearly unimpressed with the result. Well, the main thing is that Pamela is happy. I nodded silently, deciding not to rise to the provocation. The ceremony began right on schedule. Ezra stood at the altar, nervously adjusting his tie. When the wedding march began, everyone turned toward the entrance. Pamela looked stunning in her lace dress by a famous designer. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, beaming with happiness and pride. I saw Ezra's face light up at the sight of his bride, and for a moment I forgot all my doubts. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe they really do love each other. The ceremony was beautiful and touching. When the bride and groom exchanged vows, I caught myself wiping away a tear. No matter how I felt about Pamela, seeing my son's happiness at that moment was a real joy. After the ceremony, the guests moved to the luxurious banquet hall of the West Haven Hotel. Everything was tastefully decorated in white and gold, with fresh flowers and crystal chandeliers. Pamela had clearly spared no expense, and I wondered how much the wedding had cost. Ezra had mentioned a mortgage on an apartment. Had they really gotten into debt for just one day? At dinner, I was seated at a table with several of Pamela's elderly relatives and two married couples who were friends of the Tramble family. Lloyd was at another table, but he kept sending me encouraging glances. The evening went on as usual. Toasts, dancing, laughter. I stayed away from the center of attention, watching my son and his new wife. They seemed happy, dancing surrounded by guests. but I noticed Pamela whispering something to her friends several times, glancing in my direction, followed by muffled laughter. During one of the breaks between dances, Olivia Tramble approached me with a glass of champagne. "How are you enjoying the party, Mrs. Yates?" she asked with feigned politeness. "It's very beautiful," I replied. "Pamela organized everything perfectly." "Yes, my daughter always strives for perfection," she said with undisguised pride in her voice. "You know, when Ezra first came to dinner at our house, my husband and I were a little surprised by her choice. He's from such a modest background, but he turned out to be an intelligent young man with prospects. Pamela saw his potential. I held back the sharp reply that was about to slip out. Instead, I smiled and said, I also think they're well suited for each other." Olivia nodded, clearly not picking up on the irony in my tone. "I hope you don't feel uncomfortable among all these people. We're used to a certain circle of friends, you know." "Don't worry," I said calmly. "I'm perfectly comfortable." She frowned slightly, as if my answer had disappointed her, and walked away to join the other guests. Soon it was time for the traditional cake cutting. A huge three-tiered structure decorated with mastic flowers and gold leaves was wheeled into the middle of the room. Pamela and Ezra stood side by side for photos, holding the knife together. "And now let's invite the mothers of our newlyweds," announced the master of ceremonies. Olivia Tramble hurried over to her daughter. I also stood up and headed toward the cake, feeling the guests' eyes on me. "Stand here, Mrs. Yates." Pamela pointed to a spot next to her, smiling for the photographer. But I caught a strange gleam in her eyes. We posed for a few photos, then the newlyweds cut the cake. The guests applauded. Pamela took a small piece and brought it to Ezra's lips in a traditional gesture. He did the same. "And now," Pamela said, turning to me with a piece of cake on her plate, "a treat for Ezra's mom." She held out the plate to me, still smiling. I reached for it, but at the last moment Pamela seemed to stumble and the piece of cake flew straight into my face. There was a moment of silence, then someone laughed nervously. I stood there stunned, feeling the cream running down my face and onto my dress. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Pamela exclaimed with feigned regret. "Try the dessert, you poor old woman." She said the last words quietly, but loud enough for me and the guests standing nearby to hear. Her eyes sparkled with malice. Ezra stood next to me, shocked, not knowing how to react. "Pamela, what are you—" he began, but she interrupted him with laughter. "Oh, I'm such a klutz. Someone help Mrs. Yates clean herself up." Olivia Tramble handed me a napkin, unable to hide a slight smirk. "Here, dear." Such an unfortunate accident. I took the napkin and began to wipe my face, trying to maintain my dignity. The guests whispered among themselves, some continuing to laugh nervously. "That wasn't an accident," said a loud voice behind me. I turned and saw Lloyd pushing his way through the crowd of guests. "It was a deliberate gesture of disrespect to a woman who deserves much better," he continued, approaching me. "To a woman who could buy this hotel along with all your houses, cars, and bank accounts." A dead silence fell over the room. All eyes were fixed on Lloyd. "What are you talking about?" Pamela asked, no longer smiling. "I'm talking about the fact," Lloyd turned to the guests, "that Crystal Yates, whom you consider a poor old woman, is actually one of the richest women in this country. Her fortune is estimated at billions of dollars." A surprised whisper swept through the room. Pamela turned pale, her mouth opening in silent amazement. "Is this some kind of joke?" she managed to say. "Not at all," said Lloyd. "I have been Mrs. Yates' financial advisor for over 20 years. She prefers to live modestly and not flaunt her wealth. But I can't stand by and watch you humiliate her in front of everyone." Ezra looked from Lloyd to me, His eyes filled with disbelief and shock. Mom, is this true? I took a deep breath. This wasn't how I planned to reveal my secret, but I had no choice. Yes, Ezra, it's true. Pamela seemed to come to her senses. Her face, which had been as pale as a sheet, was now covered with red spots. She took a step toward me, reaching out her hand. Mrs. Yates, I didn't know. It was a stupid joke. I never meant to offend you. I stepped back, avoiding her touch. Don't bother, Pamela. Your true feelings toward me were clear from the beginning. The only difference is that now you know who you really offended. Olivia Tramble approached us, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. But, but how? You're an accountant from a small town? An accountant who knows how to manage finances, I replied calmly, and prefers not to flaunt her wealth. Ezra was still standing nearby, shaken. Why didn't you ever tell me? He asked quietly. I wanted you to grow up to be an independent person who didn't rely on his mother's money, I said, looking him in the eyes. And it seems I was right to fear that the truth might attract a certain kind of person. My gaze shifted to Pamela, who now looked as if she was ready to sink through the floor. The guests stood in an awkward silence, not knowing how to react to the drama unfolding before them. The master of ceremonies tried to lighten the mood by announcing that it was time to dance, but no one moved. I think I'd better leave, I said, still wiping the cream from my face. I don't want to ruin your party any more than I already have. No, Mom, please. Ezra took my hand. We need to talk. Not now, I said gently, pulling away. It's your wedding. Enjoy your day. We'll talk later. Lloyd came over to me. I'll walk you out. We headed for the exit, followed by the stunned stares of the guests. I felt a tear roll down my cheek, mixing with the remains of the cake frosting. Wait. Pamela caught up with us at the door. Her face was desperate. Mrs. Yates, please don't go. I'm so sorry for my behavior. It was a stupid, cruel joke. I don't even know what came over me. You know, Pamela, I turned to her, money doesn't change people. It just allows them to be who they really are. And today, you showed your true colors, not only to me, but to everyone here, including my son. She started to say something, but I raised my hand to stop her. I'm leaving now. You go back to your guests and try to salvage what's left of your wedding. With that, I left the hall, leaving behind Pamela with a look of utter despair on her face and the whispering guests, who had not yet fully realized what a drama they had just witnessed. The ride back to the hotel was silent. Lloyd drove, occasionally glancing at me with concern, but not breaking the silence. I sat looking out the window at the city lights rushing by, still feeling the sticky residue of cake on my face. Are you okay? He finally asked when we stopped at the hotel entrance. No, I replied honestly. But I will be. He nodded, understanding that I needed space and time to think. Call me if you need me, anytime. I gratefully squeezed his hand and got out of the car. In my room, the first thing I did was take a long shower, washing away the traces of humiliation along with the remains of cream and makeup. Standing under the stream of water, I finally allowed myself to cry, silently, as I had grown accustomed to doing over many years of loneliness. When my emotions subsided, I felt a strange sense of relief. The secret I had kept for decades was no longer a burden. The world hadn't collapsed. The sky hadn't fallen to the ground. What I had feared so much had happened, but I was still standing. Wrapped in a soft hotel bathrobe, I sat down by the window with a cup of tea. My phone was ringing off the hook with calls and messages. Ezra, Pamela several times, even Olivia Tramble. I turned off the sound, not ready to talk to anyone yet. I read only one message from Lloyd. Sometimes the truth is liberating, even when it comes unexpectedly. Get some rest. Tomorrow is a new day. I fell asleep thinking about how strange life had turned out. For years, I had feared this moment, the moment when my secret would be revealed and the world would see me for who I really was. But instead of disaster, I felt liberation. The morning brought clarity and determination. I woke up with the first rays of sun, feeling rested for the first time in a long time. I lay there for a few minutes, watching the light dance on the ceiling and thinking about my next steps. The first thing I did was call Lloyd. He answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for my call. "How are you?" His voice sounded genuinely concerned. "Better than I expected," I replied. "Can I ask you a favor?" "Of course. I need to see my lawyer. Today, if possible. Do you want to review your will?" There was no surprise in his voice. "Not just that. It's time to get my affairs in order. Life is too unpredictable, as it turns out." Lloyd promised to take care of everything and call back. When I hung up, the phone rang again immediately. Ezra. This time I answered. "Mom?" His voice sounded exhausted. "Are you okay?" "Yes, dear. Are you?" A long pause. "I don't know. Everything is so confusing. I need to talk to you, in person." I agreed to meet him at a cafe near the hotel in an hour. The conversation ahead of us wasn't going to be easy, but there was no point in putting it off. The cafe turned out to be a cozy place with a vintage interior and soft jazz music playing in the background. Ezra was already waiting for me at a table in the corner, twirling a cup of cold coffee in his hands. He looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. He clearly hadn't slept all night. "Hi," I said, sitting down across from him and trying to sound calm. "Hi," he said, looking up at me. His eyes showed a mixture of emotions: resentment, confusion, curiosity. I don't even know where to start. "How about questions?" I suggested. "I'm sure you have a lot of them." He nodded, gathering his thoughts. "Is it true? Are you really a billionaire?" "Yes," I replied simply. "For quite some time now." "But how?" He shook his head. "You've always lived so modestly. No mansions, expensive cars, private jet travel." "Because it's not necessary for happiness," I shrugged. "I'm comfortable in my house. I love my garden and my neighbors. Why change something that brings me satisfaction?" "But you could. We could." He faltered, unable to find the words. "Have everything?" I smiled softly. "Would that make us happier?" Ezra was silent, clearly struggling with conflicting emotions. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally blurted out. "All these years, I thought we were barely making ends meet. Remember how I worked part-time in high school to buy my first computer? Or how I took out student loans for college, which I secretly paid off," I added quietly. His eyes widened. "What?" "I paid off your loans when you were a sophomore. An anonymous benefactor, but I wanted you to value your education, to understand the value of things. So this was all manipulation?" His voice was tinged with anger. "A test? An experiment on your own son?" "No, Ezra." I shook my head. "It was protection. I saw what money does to people, how it changes relationships, distorts values. Your father left us for a woman he thought was rich. Imagine how your life would have been different if you had grown up knowing what we were capable of. Who would you have become? What friends would you have chosen?" He was silent, thinking about my words. "I wanted you to grow up to be a person who values hard work, honesty, and real relationships," I continued. "A person who achieves success on his own, not by basking in his mother's wealth." "And how do you think I turned out?" he asked bitterly. "More than you," I smiled. "You've achieved everything on your own. A good education, a career, the respect of your colleagues. I'm proud of you, Ezra. I've always been proud of you." He looked away, clearly softening but still processing the information. "What about Pamela?" he finally asked. "What do you think of her?" I chose my words carefully. "I think you know the answer, especially after yesterday." She was upset, nervous. He began to defend himself, but without much enthusiasm. "Ezra," I interrupted him gently, "what she did yesterday was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of humiliation. And it's not that she didn't know about my condition. It's that she thought it was acceptable to treat someone she considered insignificant that way." He lowered his head, acknowledging the truth of my words. "She called me all night," he said quietly. "She cried, apologized, said it was a stupid joke." "And you believe her?" "I don't know." He ran his hand through his hair in a gesture of despair. "It's all so confusing. We were supposed to be on a plane to Bali right now, and instead, you're sitting here talking to a mother who turned out not to be who you thought she was." I finished for him. "I'm sorry things turned out this way." "Don't apologize," he said unexpectedly firmly. "It's not your fault. If Pamela hadn't made such a scene, if she had just treated you with respect." We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Ezra asked, "What now?" "Now you have to make a decision," I replied. "About your life, about your marriage. I won't interfere." "And you? What are you going to do?" "I'm going home. I'll continue living my life," I smiled. "Only now, perhaps, I'll allow myself to be a little more open. There are projects I've wanted to do for a long time." "What kind of projects?" "Improving Rockville, for example. The town needs a new park. The hospital needs renovating. I can do a lot now that I don't have to hide." Ezra nodded, smiling sincerely for the first time since we met. "You know, I've always liked Rockville. Quiet, cozy. I missed it, even though I didn't admit it to myself." "You can always come back," I said. "My door's always open for you." "Thanks," he said, covering my hand with his. "I need time to think things through, to sort things out with Pamela, with our marriage." "Of course," I nodded understandingly. "I'll be here for a few more days if you need me." We said goodbye, hugging each other tighter than usual. Something had changed between us, perhaps for the better. At least now our relationship was based on truth, not a carefully maintained illusion. When I returned to the hotel, I found a message from Lloyd. He had arranged a meeting with my lawyer, Harrison King, at 2 p.m. at his office in the city center. At exactly 2 p.m., I entered the glass building on Madison Avenue. Harrison greeted me with his usual reserved smile. We had worked together for over 15 years, and he knew all my business. "Mrs. Yates, it's good to see you," he said, showing me into his spacious office with a view of the city skyline. Mr. Brooks gave me a brief overview of the situation. "How can I help you?" "I need to review my will," I said, settling into a leather chair, "and discuss setting up a charitable foundation." We spent the next 2 hours discussing the changes to my financial arrangements in detail. I decided to exclude Pamela from my will entirely. Ezra would remain the heir to part of the estate, but a larger share would now go to a charitable foundation dedicated to the development of Rockville and educational programs for children from low-income families. "These are significant changes," Harrison remarked, making notes. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," I nodded. "The events of the last few days have shown me that it's time to take responsibility for what I have, to use these resources wisely rather than just hoarding them." "What about your house?" he asked. "Given your new plans, you might want to move to something more?" "No," I replied firmly. "I'm staying in my house. It's dear to me, and it's comfortable enough for one person." Harrison nodded understandingly and continued filling out the paperwork. When all the formalities were completed, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was as if one stage of my life had ended and another had begun, one that was more conscious, more purposeful. When I left the office, I found several missed calls from Pamela. Sighing, I decided that sooner or later I would have to talk to her. Better now than letting the situation fester. I called her back, preparing myself for a flood of apologies and excuses. Mrs. Yates, her voice sounded agitated. Thank you for calling back. I was so worried. What did you want, Pamela? I asked bluntly. I I wanted to apologize for yesterday. It was awful of me. I don't know what came over me. Nerves, wedding stress. Pamela, I interrupted her. Let's be honest with each other. You didn't act that way because of stress. You just showed your true feelings toward me. No, you're wrong. I've always respected you. Really? I couldn't help a hint of irony. Then why did you call me a poor old woman? She fell silent, clearly unprepared for such a direct question. It was a stupid joke, she finally blurted out. I didn't mean. You did, I said firmly. And you know what? It's actually a good thing that this happened. At least now we all know the truth about my situation and about your character. Mrs. Yates, please, she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. Let's meet and talk. I can explain everything. Ezra is so upset. Ezra isn't upset because of me, I said. He's upset because he saw a new side of you. That's not fair. One action doesn't define a person. I really love Ezra, and I want to mend our relationship, especially now that. She didn't finish her sentence, but I knew what she was going to say. Now that I know you're rich. Pamela, I said wearily, I'm not going to be your enemy, but I'm not going to pretend nothing happened either. Right now, you need to figure things out with Ezra. That's between the two of you. But you're his mother. He listens to you. If you told him, I'm not going to interfere, I said firmly. Ezra is a grown man and will make his own decisions. She started to say something again, but I gently interrupted her. I have to go, Pamela. Good luck. I hung up, feeling strangely relieved. For the first time in a long time, I had said what I really thought without filtering my words through the prism of a secret that had to be kept. That evening, I met Lloyd for dinner at a small restaurant near the hotel. He listened to my story about my meetings with Ezra, the lawyer, and my conversation with Pamela with his characteristic attention and understanding. You've changed, he remarked when I finished. It's as if a heavy burden has been lifted. I have, I smiled. It's strange, isn't it? For so many years I was afraid of this moment, and now I feel only relief. It's not as strange as it seems. He shook his head. Secrets have a way of weighing us down, even when we think they're protecting us. What do you think will happen to Ezra and Pamela? I asked, stirring my tea. It's hard to say. Lloyd shrugged. But if Ezra inherited even a fraction of your insight, he'll make the right choice. I hope so, I sighed. I don't want him to suffer. Sometimes suffering is a necessary part of growing up, Lloyd remarked philosophically. You know that better than most. I nodded, thinking about my own journey, about the years of loneliness, the secret I had kept, the decisions I had made, some right, some wrong. When are you going back to Rockville? Lloyd asked, interrupting my thoughts. In 3 days. I want to give Ezra time to figure things out before I leave. I can go with you, he offered. Help with setting up the foundation, with plans for improvements. I looked at him gratefully. All these years, Lloyd had been not just my financial advisor, but also a friend, perhaps my only true friend who knew me completely, with all my secrets and fears. I'd love to, I replied sincerely. We stayed up late discussing plans for the future, ideas for the foundation, projects for Rockville, possible trips, everything I had put off for years, afraid of drawing attention to my wealth. Back at the hotel, I stood at the window for a long time, looking out at New York at night. The city never sleeps, always moving, always changing. Maybe it was time for me to change too? Not in the sense of moving or radically changing my lifestyle. I still loved my quiet home in Rockville, my garden, my books, but perhaps it was time to be more open, to use my resources not only for myself, but for others as well. I went to bed feeling peaceful and excited. Tomorrow would be a new day, and I would face it without the burden of a secret I had carried for too long. 6 months was enough time to process what had happened and start a new chapter in my life. Autumn in Rockville greeted me with its familiar quiet and golden falling leaves. I stood on the porch of my house, watching the wind swirl them in a leisurely dance, and felt a strange sense of peace. So much had changed in those 6 months, but my home remained the same safe haven I could always return to. After the scandalous wedding, I spent another week in New York, giving Ezra time to think things over. We met twice. At first, he was confused and hurt, but then he gradually began to accept the truth. Our last conversation before I left was difficult. Pamela and I have decided to take a break, he said, staring into his cup of cold coffee. She moved in with her parents. I nodded, expressing neither joy nor regret. His decisions were his own, and I had long since learned to respect that. What about the honeymoon? We canceled it, he said with a bitter smile. The money's gone, but right now that seems like the least of my problems. What are you planning to do? I don't know, he shrugged. Work, think, figure out what was real and what was an illusion. I saw pain in his eyes, but also the beginnings of wisdom. Perhaps this experience, however bitter, would teach him to see people for who they really are. When I returned to Rockville, I felt like I had found myself again. For the first time in many years, I could live openly, without fear that anyone would find out about my condition. That didn't mean I started flaunting my wealth. My lifestyle remained modest, but the constant tension, the need to control every word and every gesture, was gone. My first project was the Rockville Renaissance Charitable Foundation. With Lloyd's help and a team of professionals, we developed a strategy to revitalize the city without destroying its historic character and cozy atmosphere. The old houses had to be preserved, but given a new lease on life. The roads had to be renovated without widening them or turning quiet streets into noisy thoroughfares. The parks had to be expanded and made more comfortable for recreation. My meeting with the mayor, Walter Jenkins, took place in early July. I remembered him as the young assistant to the previous mayor, energetic, full of ideas, but limited by the budget of a small town. Over the years, he had matured, his hair had turned gray, and deep wrinkles had appeared from constant worry, but the enthusiasm in his eyes had not faded. Mrs. Yates, he shook my hand when we met in his modest office in the town hall. To what do I owe this honor? I have a proposal that may interest you, Mr. Jenkins. I smiled, taking out a folder with documents. How would you feel about a major renovation of our town? His eyebrows shot up when he saw the numbers on the first page. That's $20 million in the first phase. I nodded, and the same amount over the next 5 years. But he looked up from the documents and back at me, clearly trying to process the situation. Forgive me for being blunt, but where did you get the money? I briefly explained the history of my fortune, leaving out the personal details. His surprise gradually gave way to understanding. So, all these years, you could have lived anywhere, any way you wanted, but you chose Rockville and a normal life? This town has become my home, I replied simply. I want it to thrive, but retain its character. No skyscrapers or giant shopping malls, just what people really need. We spent several hours discussing the details of the project. A new park on the site of an abandoned factory on the outskirts, modern equipment for the hospital, road repairs, school renovations. The list was long but realistic. You know, said the mayor as we were finishing our meeting, it's not every day that someone comes into my office and offers to change the city for the better without asking for anything in return. Well, not quite nothing, I smiled. I want the park to be named after my son, Ezra. Is that all? He shook his head with slight disbelief. Consider it done. The next day, the local newspaper ran the headline, Secret Rockville Billionaire, Crystal Yates Donates Millions to Improve City. The article was written with respect, without sensationalism, for which I was grateful to the editor. Nevertheless, my quiet life was temporarily disrupted. Neighbors looked at me with curiosity. Some approached with questions, others with offers of help or ideas for projects. Fortunately, the initial excitement quickly subsided. The residents of Rockville, with the practical approach typical of small towns, accepted the news and moved on. I was still Mrs. Yates who lives in the house with the blue shutters to them, only now with the addition of and helps our town. Lloyd moved to Rockville in August. He stayed at a local hotel at first, but soon bought a small but elegant house not far from downtown. We spent a lot of time together, working on foundation projects, discussing investments, or simply enjoying quiet evenings of conversation and good wine. Our friendship, tested over decades, gradually grew into something more, though neither of us was in a hurry to define it. In mid-September, I received the first letter from Ezra after a long silence. He wrote that he had divorced Pamela. The process had been quick, given the short duration of the marriage and the lack of joint property. He was changing jobs, moving to another part of New York, trying to start over. I think about you often, Mom, he wrote. About our conversation after the wedding, about what you said about money and character. You were right. Pamela changed as soon as she found out about your condition. She suddenly started talking about our opportunities, about how we could invest family capital. It was as if your money already belonged to us. I read his letter with bitterness and relief at the same time. Bitterness because he was suffering, relief because he had finally seen the true face of the woman he had chosen to share his life with. I'd like to come see you, he concluded, to talk, if you don't mind. I replied the same day, inviting him to come whenever he wanted. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my son, and I loved him. Ezra arrived in early October, when Rockville was especially beautiful in its autumn colors. He looked thinner but calmer than when I had last seen him. There was a new depth in his eyes, as if life experience had finally reached his soul. We walked around town for a long time, talking about everything and nothing in particular. He asked about my projects and my plans for the future. I told him, trying not to focus on the financial side of things. You've changed, Mom, he remarked as we sat on a park bench watching the leaves fall. You've become freer, I guess. That's right, I agreed. The truth sets you free, even if it hurts. He nodded, realizing that this applied to his own experience as well. I wanted to apologize, he said after a pause, for Pamela, for her behavior at the wedding, and for mine, too. I should have noticed how she felt about you. I should have stopped her. You're not to blame for her actions, I said, gently touching his hand. Or for your feelings either. Love often blinds us. It wasn't love, he said bitterly. I realize that now. It was more like infatuation, attraction. She knew how to make an impression, how to manipulate people. And I gave in. We were silent, each lost in our own thoughts. She called me last week, Ezra said unexpectedly. Pamela, she said she missed me, that she'd made a mistake. She asked me to start over. I tensed up, but tried not to show it. And what did you say? That some bridges can't be rebuilt after they've burned down. He smiled weakly. She wasn't happy to hear that. She started talking about how I was missing out, how we could have achieved so much together, especially with your resources. She said that? I couldn't hide my surprise. Almost word for word. Ezra nodded. When I replied that I had nothing to do with your money and wasn't going to count on it, she got angry. She said I was a fool not to take advantage of such an opportunity, that any normal son would try to convince his mother to share her fortune with him. I shook my head, struck not so much by Pamela's words as by her directness. I told her I didn't want to see her anymore, Ezra continued, and asked her not to call me. I don't know if she'll listen. She's persistent when she wants something, I remarked. Yeah, he sighed. By the way, did you know she tried to contact you? Through your foundation? I raised my eyebrows in surprise. No, I didn't know that. Lloyd told me. She offered her services as a PR consultant. She said she could help with media coverage for projects. I couldn't help but chuckle. Amazing persistence. More like amazing greed. Ezra shook his head. I'm so ashamed I didn't see it before. We see what we're ready to see, I said softly, and we learn from our mistakes. Ezra stayed in Rockville for 3 days. During that time, he got to know Lloyd, helped with some of the foundation's projects, and even met with the mayor to discuss the future of the park that would bear his name. When it was time to say goodbye, I felt that a new bond had formed between us, one that was more honest, more mature. Come visit any time, I said, hugging him before he left. This house is always open to you. Thank you, Mom, he said, hugging me tightly in return. For everything. After he left, life returned to its peaceful course, working on foundation projects, evenings with Lloyd, correspondence with Ezra, who now called and wrote regularly. Autumn flowed smoothly into winter. Rockville was covered with a blanket of snow, and in my heart I felt a growing certainty that life was finally on the right track. Before Christmas, Pamela called me. I wasn't expecting the call, but when I heard her voice, I knew I was ready for it. Mrs. Yates, she said softly, almost ingratiatingly, I'm so glad I was able to reach you. How are you? Fine, Pamela, I replied neutrally. To what do I owe the call? I wanted to wish you a happy holiday season, she paused, and to apologize, again, for everything that happened at the wedding and after. Thank you, I said, not saying that I accepted her apology. I wasn't sure I did. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, she continued, about what an amazing example you are, a woman who uses her wealth to help others rather than to enrich herself. It's so inspiring. I remained silent, waiting to see where she was going with this. You know, I work in advertising. I have a lot of experience in image creation and media campaigns. Her voice became more businesslike. I could help your foundation get more attention and attract additional funds from other philanthropists. Free of charge, of course. It would be my way of making amends. That's what it was. I suppressed a sigh. Thank you for the offer, Pamela, but we already have a team of specialists, and to be honest, we're not looking for publicity. But it's such an opportunity, she exclaimed, momentarily forgetting her ingratiating tone. With your resources and my experience, we could— Pamela, I interrupted her gently. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but my decision is final. Thank you for calling and for your congratulations. And happy holidays to you, too. I hung up, feeling a mixture of disappointment and relief. People rarely change radically, especially people like Pamela, for whom personal gain always comes first. That evening, I told Lloyd about the call as we sat by the fireplace in my house, sipping hot punch. She's persistent. You have to give her that, he remarked with a touch of irony. But I'm glad you didn't give in. I learned to recognize insincerity a long time ago. I shrugged. Although I haven't always acted on that knowledge. We all make mistakes. Lloyd covered my hand with his. What matters is that we learn from them. I looked at our intertwined fingers and felt warmth spreading through my body. This man had been there for me during the most difficult times, never judging, always supportive. And now, when life was finally starting to fall into place, he was still here. I think we should go on a trip, I said unexpectedly, after New Year's. Somewhere far away, where no one knows us. A trip? He looked surprised but interested. Where? Everywhere, I smiled. Around the world. I've always dreamed of seeing the world, but I never allowed myself to because I was afraid of drawing attention to my condition. Now that fear is gone, why not? Lloyd looked at me with warmth and understanding. That sounds wonderful. I'd love to keep you company. I spent Christmas at home with my new friends from the foundation and a few neighbors I had gotten close to over the past few months. Ezra flew in for 2 days, bringing gifts and news about his life. He finally looked happy. He had found a new job that he liked, made friends, and even started dating a girl, although he admitted that he had become much more cautious after his experience with Pamela. When I told him about my plans to travel with Lloyd, he was genuinely happy for me. You deserve it, Mom, he said, hugging me, to see the world, enjoy life. Thank you, dear. I was touched by his support. Will you be okay? Of course, he smiled. I'm fine, and it's only getting better. After the holidays, active preparations for the trip began. Lloyd and I planned to leave at the end of January, first to South America, then Africa, then Asia, Australia, and finish the tour in Europe. A 6-month trip, without rushing, with the opportunity to stay wherever we liked. At the same time, I was busy with the foundation, making sure that everything would run smoothly in my absence. We managed to accomplish a lot during those months. Construction of the park began, the hospital received new equipment, and the roads in the city center were repaired. Even more projects were planned for the future. In mid-January, I met with Harrison King, my lawyer, to make some final changes to my will. After much thought, I decided to leave Ezra only a small portion of my estate, enough to ensure he would live comfortably, but not so much that it would discourage him from working and growing. The bulk of the funds were earmarked for the Rockville Renaissance Foundation, which was to continue its work after my death. Pamela was completely excluded from the document. I knew that even if she got back together with Ezra, which was highly unlikely, she should not have access to money that she would use solely for her own interests. Are you sure about this distribution? Harrison asked, looking through the documents. Absolutely, I nodded. Ezra will get enough to live comfortably, but not so much that he loses himself. And the town that has become my home will have a chance to thrive. Harrison nodded understandingly and finished the paperwork. A week before I left, I received a strange call from Olivia Tramble, Pamela's mother. She had never called me before, and I was surprised to hear her voice. Mrs. Yates, she said tensely, as if forcing herself to speak. I'm calling about my daughter. I'm listening, I replied neutrally. She hasn't been herself lately, Olivia continued. She talks about you all the time, about your money, about how she could help you manage it. My husband and I are worried. I was silent, not knowing how to respond to this strange confession. I understand that you don't have to help us after everything that's happened, she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. But maybe you could meet with her, talk to her, explain that her obsessions are pointless. Mrs. Tramble, I tried to speak gently but firmly. I sympathize with your situation, but I don't think meeting with your daughter will change anything. Perhaps she should see a professional. Olivia sighed. We've tried to suggest that, but she refuses. She says she's fine, that you just don't understand her potential. I'm sorry, but I can't help you, I said firmly. I'm going away for a long time and don't plan on seeing her before I leave. Please tell Pamela that she should let go of these ideas and move on with her life. After that conversation, I felt strangely uneasy. Pamela's obsession was starting to seem unhealthy, almost dangerous. I told Lloyd about the call, and he suggested we increase security at the house while we were away. I agreed, although I didn't think Pamela, for all her obsession, was capable of anything truly extreme. Finally, the day of our departure arrived. The suitcases were packed, the house was prepared for the long absence of its mistress, and the foundation's affairs were in the capable hands of a team of professionals. I stood on the porch, looking out at my garden, now covered in snow, and felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. Lloyd pulled up at 9 o'clock sharp, as we had agreed. He got out of the car and helped me with my luggage, his movements calm and confident as always. Ready for adventure? He asked with a smile. More than ready, I smiled back, feeling my heart fill with joyful excitement. We got into the car and headed for the airport. Rockville saw us off with quiet streets, snow-covered trees, and smoke rising from chimneys. I knew I would return here, maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year. But at that moment, I was ready to let go of the past and look to the future with an open heart. The world was waiting for us, with its beauty and dangers, wonders and disappointments. And I was ready to meet it, finally free from the burden of a secret I had carried for too long. What are you thinking about? Lloyd asked, noticing my thoughtfulness. About life, I replied. About how strange it can be sometimes. Who would have thought a year ago that being humiliated at my son's wedding would be the beginning of my true liberation? Life is full of irony, he smiled, and unexpected twists and turns. Yes, I said, looking out the window at the winter landscape passing by. And I'm grateful for that, for all the twists and turns that have brought me here, to this moment. Lloyd took his eyes off the road for a moment and looked at me warmly. Me too. We drove in silence, enjoying the moment and anticipating everything that lay ahead. A new chapter in my life was beginning, not the one I had planned or expected, but perhaps the one I had always been looking for.